So many of the things I'm going to say, I thought this is actually an interesting example of what a workshop does best. So I'll try not to repeat some of the things that Simon presented. I'll try to offer a different way to read Simmel, less pessimistic. So in that sense, it'll be a good debate or discussion. And then also following up on something that Simon said, I'll try to explore other facets, other aspects of Simmel's philosophy of money that Simon didn't get a chance to look at. And then likewise, there will be other aspects, some aspects that Simon looked at and other aspects that none of us have looked at because, as Simon mentioned, it's an extremely rich book. And so, like many of earlier talks, I mean, a talk or 10,000 word essay isn't robust enough to sort of cover whatever we'd like to cover. So maybe the first thing I would like to do is, and also the other thing I thought I would do is sort of use this as a way to present the ideas that I want to sort of organize and structure more clearly in the paper that I'll write. So again, it's a bit like Jordy's paper earlier, I have different sort of elements. So I thought first of, and this is more rhetorically in the essay, that I would start with three moments in contemporary music where money is in the lyrics. Because very much in the spirit of what Simon had mentioned, one of the main claims and approaches to money for Simmel is that one can't understand modernity and modern culture without money. And so money is going to be used as an optic, as a kind of vehicle to present a kind of critique. I mean, critique in the sense of under what conditions is something like modernity possible. And one of the main interesting differences with Marx is that the concept of culture is going to be more central. It's going to be a critique of culture through the problem of money and understanding how money produces a very specific kind of culture, which is modern culture. One of the things I'm going to suggest is that Simmel is one of the first theorists of consumer society, what it is to be a consumer, and what we might call homo economicus. The other thing I'm going to sort of suggest, just to give you the sense of the flight of these comments, is that in addition to thinking about money in the way that Simon has already started sort of developing in Simmel, using money as a kind of vehicle or optic to think about modernity. So really, the context is theory of modernity, the problem of modern culture. It's not a general theory of money. It's also not a theory of the origin of money. As a third element is what I think is what's very interesting is that money then comes to shape Simmel's own view of modern life. And in the last part of my comments, I'm going to make a very alternative and daring claim that some of the key ideas that then become known and developed as existentialist conceptions of the human not only are first proposed by Simmel, but are proposed in a context where it's Simmel's thinking about money that leads him to an existential conception of the human condition. So there's a direct connection between thinking about money leads to some of the ideas about, and this goes back to the question of how do we respond to the tragedy of modern culture. Existentialism is going to be a way to redeem human authenticity in a modern world. And so that's the sense in which the analysis of money shapes his thinking about modern life. That's how I sort of end it in that regard. So before I sort of launch into that, I'm not going to sing these for you, but I thought, let's start with, we are completely obsessed with money, and so much of our culture and music is about money. So in a very Simmelian sense, I'm going to start with that. So I was going to use three quotes to sort of organize three rubrics to organize my discussion. But again, I won't sing it, I won't rap it. So the first is, if you know the Wu-Tang Clan has an amazing song called Cream, where the refrain is, cash rules everything around me, cream, get the money, dollar, 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 y'all. And so that's the idea that was similar. Okay, there we go. Of money and the problem of circulation. And one of the key ideas is that what characterizes modernity is the increased rapidity of circulation of commodities and goods, a kind of acceleration of social change. That's going to be one of the features that's going to be alienating, and that this is going to be connected with a high coefficient of social mobility of individuals. from rags to riches, etc. So one is sort of money and modern mobility, modern circulation, both in terms of goods, but also in terms of subjects, because very much echoing what Simon had mentioned, Simmel has a kind of neo-Kantian idea that money is a form not only for objects, but for subjects as well. So you can't think about money and its transformation of objects and commodities without its transformations of subjects. So there's always a kind of very Hegelian subjective side and an objective side to how he's going to analyze money. The second one, more classic, is from Pink Floyd, of course, the great song Money. And here, I won't go through that song. And of course, as you know, that song is in several different songs. Time, something that Frank had mentioned, the problem of money and time, the finitude of a life. The sun is setting in its ways, and I'm running and running, and the clock is running out. And then the problem of accumulation, having to buy a lot of things in order to fulfill myself in this life. And there's the one line, money, share it fairly, but don't take a slice of my pie, right? So that's going to be the notion of money, again, just echoing things that Simon had already talked about. I'll just piggyback on that, and how Simmel thinks about the problem of value. How do we value things? And also, how do we value ourselves as individuals? So value and self-valuing. And here, just as a historical note, it's important that Simmel is part of that first generation of German philosophers who clearly formulate the problem of value. What are values? What are aesthetic values, moral values, etc. And then the third is from T.I. and Rihanna, Live Your Life. Really wonderful song. And here the refrain is, again, it's Rihanna who sings this refrain. So live your life, got my mind on my money, and I'm not going away. So keep on getting your paper and keep on climbing. Look in the mirror and keep on shining till the game ends, till the clock stops. So there, the thesis I'm going to sort of propose, sort of attaching it to this quote, is the idea that Simmel's going to propose that money is the very medium in which the modern individual creates themselves. So in a sense, the medium or the mode in which we create ourselves, in which every decision that we make is mediated by monetary transactions. And so it's not simply that money is an instrument, but money is a medium. And ultimately, that's a sense in which he's going to think money is the end of modern life itself. And then he'll have a critique of that, just echoing what Simon had said. So those are the three sort of quotes to get circulation and mobility, value and self-valuing, and then this existential purchase of money and self-fashioning, self-constitution of the subject, again, in a modern society, because Simmel's philosophy of money is really a way to think about modernity. So let me just say one more thing before I sort of dive into this. Something also, again, I feel like I'm just echoing a lot of things that Simon had mentioned. It's important, I think, that Simmel is not going to take for granted that we as philosophers can operate as philosophers in the usual way, given that we exist in modern life, modern culture. And one of the things that Simmel is going to reject is the classic idea that the philosopher is the one who gives a theory or a foundation for anything. So this will account for, and Simon had mentioned it, the very frustrating experience of reading the philosophy of money. Instead, you might say there's a kind of ambulatory conception of the philosopher. The philosopher is sort of the flaneur who walks around modern life, a bit like Baudelaire, and is going to sort of piece together these pieces, because one of the fundamental claims of Simmel, two claims, is that what characterizes modernity is, to put it in Max Weber's famous line, it's the disenchantment of the world. There are no gods. The gods are all dead. And unlike Heidegger, there's no point in waiting for new ones. So we exist in a kind of godless universe. From a metaphysical point of view, there's no deep foundations for our values. And that's going to be the sense in which what characterizes modernity is relativism. And Simmel accepts that. The philosopher is not here to save the world from relativism. And therefore, the job of the philosopher, almost like a Richard Rorty ahead of his time, is no longer to make any foundational claims about anything. But nonetheless, there has to be something like the critical function of the philosopher. And that's to understand the conditions of possibility for the very world, in a sense, for which we cannot provide a theory. So that's one of the ways, I know we talked about it earlier, that's one of the ways why the book is a very difficult kind of book to read, because our academic training is actually very conservative vis-a-vis what, it's almost a kind of what people call the avant-garde sociology is what Simmel is doing. It's in a kind of avant-garde text that he has, that he has written. The last point, just to get a sense of, we can't take for granted how we do philosophy when we think about money in the modern world, is that Simmel as well described his own philosophy as in German, a Philosophie des Irgendwie und des Ambivalenz. So it's the philosophy of the somehow. I'm not giving a deep explanation of anything. And also, I'm going to not try to resolve ambivalence. And one of those ambivalence, I'm just going back to my expression, is on the one hand, we can look at monetary economy, modern world, consumerism, and be very pessimistic. On the other hand, we can look at it and see its, its explosion of entrepreneurship, and we can all fashion ourselves, et cetera. It's that ambivalence that Simmel is just trying to track. So there are moments where he's much more pessimistic, moments where he's not. So that's also interesting. What style of thinking and writing is the one that preserves ambivalence and therefore preserves the phenomena of modern life? So that's a sense in which it's the philosophy of the somehow, the philosophy of ambivalence. One of Simmel's students, Nicolas, said that the style of Simmel's thinking is like Monet, it's impressionistic. And that's exactly what people like Nicolas didn't like about it. Right? It wasn't decisive. It's not going to promote revolutionary change. But that clearly is the style of writing. It's like an impressionistic piece of painting. So that's a sense, because I think it's important to sort of know how Simmel understands himself as a thinker, as a writer, before one sort of reads and tries to understand what he says. Because in a sense, modernity and the complexity of modernity, and therefore why money is important, is itself reflected in the very textuality of the book. So part of the difficulty of tracking what's going on is our own difficulty. We experienced this on the first day with your dialogue toolbox. We can't track how to talk about money. We do this, we do. So in a sense, our own inadequacy to understand, we all recognize money is somehow encompassing of everything in our society. But as soon as intellectuals get together and try to figure that out, we just turn around in circles. That's how the book is written. So in a sense, the book the book doesn't think you can benefit from anything that would solve that problem. So he's simply going to embrace that fluidity. Okay, so having said that, let me just say a few things. So the first thing I'll talk about is the problem of circulation and mobility. And specifically here, I'll really echo a lot of things that Simmel said. I think I'll tweak things a bit differently, which is his conception of exchange and how money functions and quantification, et cetera. Here, let me just say one thing, that it's really important that Simmel thinks that he has this kind of metaphysical claim that values, how we value things, cannot be reduced to their material properties of things. So he starts with this very strong claim that there's what he calls the world of being, for which we can have knowledge of how things are. And then what he calls the world of value, which the world of value is not just moral values of obligation, but aesthetic values, et cetera. And those two things have to have some sort of complex relationship. When I look at a painting, I'm looking at a material object, but of course, I'm not just seeing red pigment. I'm seeing something that is beautiful, that is ugly, et cetera. And so it's in this general context of trying to understand what is value and how value relates to being, to use this very abstract vocabulary, that he thinks money is going to be important. So he advances his thinking about money as one piece of a more general theory of value, and the relationship then between value and being, just to use those very abstract terms. Now, specifically with money, he's going to have this very important claim, and here I'll sort of abbreviate things because I think Simmel sort of presented it accurately as well, that the way in which we value an object is based on what he calls a demand. So things don't have value in and of themselves. They have a value because we have a certain relationship of value to them, which is a kind of demand. And that this demand, that in terms of which we value things, doesn't occur outside of the process of exchange. So it's a very subtle idea that it's not that we have desires and needs and then we have exchange. We can't formulate and orient ourselves in our desires and needs outside of a process of exchange. So that's a sense in which exchange is always mediating and structuring our desires, if you want to put it that way. So desire is always a complex, or demand is always a complex relation. And this has something to do, and this will just be a footnote, with a kind of general claim that Simmel specifies in this analysis, that exchange is fundamentally a social relation that can have many different kinds of functions. And that the essence, if you wish, of a social relation is that it's what he calls, in German, a Wechselwirkung. It's a reciprocal interactive exchange. Just as a little footnote, maybe we can talk about this. I think that all of Simmel's vocabulary, when he speaks of objectification, subjective, is not Hegel, it's Goethe. It's all a Goethe vocabulary, something which we've sort of forgotten, that the opposition at the end of the 19th century is Hegel and Goethe. One of the many tragedies of the 20th century is that we've forgotten about Goethe as a kind of primary philosopher. So it's not a dialectical relationship, it's a synthesis. But a synthesis not in Kant's terms, but in Goethe's terms. So the spirit has to produce itself through its objectifications for self-recognition, and therefore the study of culture is a morphology of forms, and this morphology of forms are all the manifest expressions of spirit, to put it in Goethe's terms. So what that means is that exchange always mediates desire, and this is always a relationality. And then one of the aims is, what kind of complex relationality is it? The other sort of methodological footnote is that this form of relationality is not at the level yet of institutions. It's almost at the level of the microphysics of social conditions. So this is what Simmel calls in his German, which Vergesellschaftlichung, which is translated into English awkwardly association. So it's not, here are the social forms. I want to know what is he uses the German term, the Faden, what are the thin threads of interaction from which all social forms, so politeness, tipping, these are these micro, it's almost like this Foucaultian idea of a microphysics of society, and that's where he's going to start his analysis of money. So I go to the coffee shop and I use my card. All these are microphysics of social relations, which then his analysis is a bottom-up relation. So in order to understand how banks and all these things work, we first have to understand these dyadic relations, and this is why the first part of his book is analytic. This is a methodological analysis, and then it's synthetic. I put it all together. So I think that's also important, and I use this Foucaultian idea because I think Simmel already has this idea of the microphysics of power, the microphysics of governmentality, and one of these is going to be money. Money is involved in the microphysics of social life. So the key point, again, I'll just really run through this because Simmel said this, that exchange is a synthesis. In a sense, it brings different relations, so it's a relation of relations. And the key idea is that, again, as Simmel mentioned, that exchange involves sacrifice. Now, he uses the term sacrifice in the sense that, when I decide to buy this, Porsche, I decide not to send my kids to college. So that's the sense in which every decision that I make, whether I know it or not, involves opportunity cost. And again, exactly as Simmel mentioned, just piggybacking, it's not only then that objects are always inscribed in relations to other objects, but then there's also a relation of subjects to other subjects. And one of the things that Simmel analyzed very well in his essays on fashion, for example, is how in modern culture, a lot of our desire is mimetic. I desire to buy this because I recognize that others desire to buy this. So he already has a kind of Lacanian mimetic theory of desire, which he understands as central for consumer culture. That's how he's going to understand what's important about fashion. We all want to listen to Rihanna because that's what one does. So I desire that, and because I realize that it's desired by others. Now, the key point I'll just add here is therefore that Simmel has done this interesting argument that therefore value, which then is reflected in pricing and the way in which money then shapes and determines this value, is neither purely subjective but also nearly not objective in the sense that it adheres or reflects anything in the object, again, a Simmel. So he has this idea that it opens a third realm of objects, a third realm of objectivity, which we have difficulty placing on one side or the other. So in a sense, what the value, economic value that's being as marked or tracked by a price isn't simply a subjective function of pleasure or whatever else. And on the other hand, it doesn't simply reflect some quality of the object. And that's why it's quite difficult for us to get a sense of what really it's tracking and how it's constituted. And so on the one hand, this is then this other form of objectivity. It's almost like in the Marxian idea, this is the spectrality of economic value. The Gespenst is what Marx calls it, right? There's kind of spectrality of value, which is constituted or enabled through monetization and monetary value. And then on the other hand, what it allows for is then a high degree of quantification, because now we can quantify this value. And this quantification then gives the object as valuable a kind of independent existence. So that's the sense in which, in his technical vocabulary, a relation becomes a substance. So something that is purely relational and inactive becomes substantialized. So you might say that's the way in which sort of substance metaphysics arises out of social relations that become reified. That's why he uses this language. And then we think that indeed there is a value called the value of money. But there isn't. So that's a sense in which what that allows then is value to take on a kind of spectral existence that, this is the Feuerbachian, appears to have substance. So it's like Feuerbach. It's the ghost that becomes the substance. And then this is the origin of how he thinks of the alienation. The alienation is precisely that value, the economic value, strikes us as something alien. As something that then makes demands on us. Now I'll say two more things about this, that the benefit of this, if you wish, for Simmel is that it allows, therefore, for greater circulation of goods and values because of the quantification, but also because of the autonomy, the quasi-autonomy of the commodity. So that's a sense in which like everything in Simmel, it's ambivalent. On the one hand, it alienates us, but on the one hand, allows greater circulation. And not only greater circulation, but in his language, the greater increase of circulation. So this is why he's interested in fashion, because fashion is the perpetual acceleration of the produce of commodities that circulate and have its own kind of autonomy. Or the music industry is something like that as well. Now, let me just say two more things about this. That value is also, as I've just described it for Simmel, what he calls a measure of distance, in the sense that what I need to sacrifice in order to get this, sacrifice my kids' education that's a kind of obstacle. So the cost for me in terms of what I have to sacrifice to obtain this object is a kind of distance. It's a distance between the subject and object that I have to overcome in order to acquire it. But what's interesting about the quantification that then is produced through monetization is that it's precisely this distance that gets obfuscated. And that's going to be the essence of consumer culture. That everything, and you might say that Amazon is the great example of that. You just click a button and miraculously your good is there. So the tremendous distances that exist between us and the things that we want, insofar that any time that we want something, it's always in terms of obstacles that we have to overcome in terms of opportunity costs, but also in terms of the conditions, the social conditions under which these things were produced, because that also has a cost. That what the quantification that is produced through monetization of these commodities produces is a kind of naturalization of goods, or an obfuscation. Because I just think that, I just show up in the store and I buy my meat, and the effortlessness of swiping my card obfuscates all of the complex relations that are needed and have cost for that meat to come. Now, of course, Simmel wasn't, animal rights. But you can see how you can go in that, you need all of these meat packing plants in Nebraska and immigrant workers and et cetera, and climate costs. All of that is crystallized in the opportunity cost of the object. But precisely what a highly monetized capitalist economy allows us to do is to sort of buy without conscience. And that is the sense in which there is a kind of obfuscation of sacrifice through monetary interactions. So it's an interesting use of the concept of sacrifice. We don't realize that we're sacrificing something. And that is itself part of the ruse of the monetary process as a form of sacrifice. And just to echo something that Simmel says, this is the way in which it resolves us. I'm just going to quote you now. It resolves us from thinking about the material conditions of production. And again, Amazon is the best example. I just click it and Prime delivery, the drone is here and it'll be here in 2 minutes. The last thing I'll say again about this circulation is that Simmel has this claim. He says, I'll just read it: money is the clearest embodiment of the formula of all being, And what he means by that is what money allows us to do, monetary transactions, is to bring order to flux. So he has this sort of claim that one of the things that characterizes a modern society is that it's a Heraclitean flux. Sometimes he almost makes this a metaphysical claim about reality as such. So the interesting thing, this leads us to the question of money as an optic to think about modernity, is modernity is a kind of a totality of social relations that is in constant motion, that it is undergoing constant transformation without there being an encompassing sense of the whole. And it's precisely the monetarization of all of these relations to objects which allows us to exist in a pure Heraclitean flux. It gives unity to something without giving it a kind of substantial unity. So that's how he thinks that money allows for the totality of society to enter into relationship without there being a substantial unity. And that's the sense in which then money is the optic to understand that there's a transactional interconnectedness between every part of society with every other part, without us being able to say this is the unity of the whole. So that's the sense in which money then becomes now not just the object of analysis, but the optic for the analysis of modernity itself. It's going to be almost the cipher of modernity, insofar that modernity is living in a totality of social relations that we can't cognitively grasp under a whole, and that we can't bring to a foundation. It's not that God created the world. There's no absolute values. Now, interestingly enough, Simmel thinks that what this starts to produce, now this starts to be the more critical aspect, is that Simmel thinks that this accounts for what he claims is the increasing ambivalence in a modern society of what he calls intellectualism. So increased detachment from the qualitative value of things, again, things that Simmel mentioned, and a kind of increased quantification of our understanding of our world. Here he has a thesis very similar to Max Weber, that modernity is instrumental rationality in law, in economics, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, it produces a high degree of intellectualism, detachment, and what he calls in German Blasiertheit, so indifference and boredom. So he has a kind of interesting analysis for why boredom is a prevalent phenomenon of modern societies. It's connected with intellectualism. But then on the other hand, it produces a kind of manic attempt for individuals to intensify their pleasure. So he has this ambivalence. We become much more intellectual, much more bored, and much more manically obsessed with Erlebnisse, intensification of our experiences. You might say that this leads to the phenomenon of consumer culture as caught between a kind of rapacious consumption and a kind of ravenous boredom, right? And here, if I had more time, in the paper, I would give a short analysis of American Psycho and Patrick Bateman. Where the subject of the novel is not Patrick Bateman, but a modern corporation as a person. And the modern corporation of a person has this feature of consumption, the seeking of intensity of experience, highly individuated, but at the same time, the kind of emptying of any meaning and a kind of indifference. And of course, that Patrick Bateman's, if you know the film or the novel, his relationship to music, to fashion, etc., is precisely that kind of schizophrenia. That's the psychotic thing. So this is, again, the ambivalence of modern culture as, experience and intellectualization. Simmel, interestingly, sees this as the two dominant forms of philosophy in the 20th century. Erlebnis, Lebensphilosophie, irrationalism, and, well, Jordy's not here, Vienna School, hyper-rationalism, right? Those are going to be the two tendencies of thinking that is produced by modern society. Okay, now let me move to the second part, and I'll run very briefly. Now we're using money as a kind of metaphor or cipher for modernity. So it's not an analysis of money in modernity, it's money itself becomes a kind of optic or concept to understand modernity. And you can see this is the reciprocal back and forth between money and modernity that Simmel operates. So here, very, very briefly, I'm going to propose that what Simmel does, this is in the second part of the book, which is where he tries to understand how does money in the modern world, as he's analyzed it, then impact life itself, or the style of life is how he calls it. I'm going to propose, though he doesn't use this term, that he's really already proposing a kind of theory of consumer culture and homo consumericus. So there's a kind of anthropological transformation that happens with the human condition. Because again, Simmel thinks that there is no universal human condition. It is always transformed by the society in which it objectifies itself. So here, he's going to have this argument that on the one hand, what constitutes the impact of money in the modern world on the human condition, producing what I'm calling homo consumericus, is that, as he writes, since money itself in our society is an omnipresent means, the various elements of our existence are thus placed in an all-embracing teleological nexus in which no element is either the first or the last. So what he means by that is that money on the one hand is a means, but it also breaks down the very distinction between means and ends because of its all-pervasive function of mediation. And so this produces a very interesting sort of a dilemma that in modern society, our existence is caught in a kind of flux of perpetual change without any embracing teleological meaning. So in a sense, money becomes an end in of itself, not because we're pursuing money, but because we can never ask ourselves, what is the overall meaning of the entire process itself? So it produces a kind of breakdown in human teleology, both in terms of society. We don't know what the purpose of capitalism is anymore. I mean, it's not freedom in the world. It's not after 1989, liberalism. And we don't know ultimately what the ultimate purpose of our own lives is. And so that's the sense in which it produces a kind of purposiveness without purpose. He uses this Kantian idea, but it doesn't have the aesthetic allure of pleasure as in Kant. So he's going to give an example for this, and this is in his essay on fashion. So he writes a really wonderful essay on fashion, where he says that fashion exemplifies this, because fashion is, in his thinking, what he calls the pursuit of an absolute value in the moment. I have to dress like P. Diddy or whatever. So it's the pursuit of an absolute value that can never be reached. It's always purely relative and has no intrinsic value in itself. So he thinks that fashion is an example of how there's a kind of pursuit of wanting something authentic and absolute. But it's a pursuit that is always repeating itself and always relativizing itself, and therefore the pursuit of fashion has no intrinsic value. So the point of fashion is just to make fashion for the sake of making fashion and monetization, etc. Here, if I had more time, I would show you Andy Warhol's Prince of the Dollar Sign, right? Because you could say that Andy Warhol understood, what's the point of art? Nothing other than making art for the point of generating a commodity and money. It has no value other than that. So that's a sense in which also then you have the autonomous flow of the fashion industry and art, etc. So, and that's the sense in which then fashion shows this sort of restlessness of modern life, and this manic sense of the new and the fetishism of the new, which always overcomes itself. So we are sort of damned to know that there's no finality in our world, even though we always think that today is it. Right, and here, if we had more time, we could analyze the phenomenon of the it girl in the 20s, right, which is the first manifestation of this is it. No, this is it. This is it. This is it. This is it. And this is the eternal recurrence of meaningless that gives the appearance of meaning. So that's what he means by this is the anthropological condition of the individual. The other point I'll just make briefly is one has to understand that Simmel has a very particular conception of what it is to be an individual. He thinks that an individual is the attempt to sort of bring together various parts of who I am into a kind of cohesive whole, but the inability to do so because of the complex demands that is made on myself. So he has a purely relational notion of the self. The self is many selves. I am the professor who is now presenting to you and abiding by academic norms. I'm the father, playing silly games with my kids. I'm, drunk with my friends. I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. So we have all of these identities that are inscribed in social relations, and the individual is trying to always create themselves as one from a plurality, and always caught between fragmentation and unity, fragmentation and unity. And this is something that then money allows us to negotiate. Money allows us to negotiate because money allows me to move from one world to another, and adopt one identity from another. And this is why I use these, especially the Rihanna song is really, money is the means for me to be a self and enter a world and then move from one world to another. So it's important that he has and he thinks that this is not a notion of the self for all time. It's a notion of the self in a highly individualistic society. And so another way to think about it is that we're constantly trying to find unity with others, want to belong to a group, but at the same time, we're always trying to distinguish ourselves from every other. So this is what he calls the paradox of the individual. Again, fashion is a good example of that. I want to wear this, P. Diddy shirt or put a tattoo, no offense against tattoos, to be individual, but the tattoo is itself a symbol that gives a certain allegiance or puts me in a certain group, the group of those who have tattoos, the group of Cardinals fans or what have you. So that's the paradox. We're always competing to be different from each other, but we can only be different from each other by belonging to groups which then differentiate themselves from other groups. And that's again going to be part of the tragedy of modern culture, that we can't find that equilibrium. We can't find that sort of unity. Okay, so now last point, just to bring these, again, very Simmelian style, these little constellations of ideas. I'm being a flaneur in the text that itself is a flaneur. So now I want to sort of suggest as the last thought that not only is money a kind of object of analysis for Simmel, not only is money itself the optic for an analysis. So money in the modern world, it's an object of analysis. Money as the optic to understand the modern world. So money now not as an object, but as an optic. But now I want to sort of propose that money then, his analysis of money as both an optic and an object, itself becomes a kind of catalyst for his own thinking. And this is now, we step outside the bounds of the book Philosophy of Money, which is 1900. Simmel, during the First World War, he's dying of cancer because he was diagnosed with cancer in the midst of the war, and he starts to write what he calls his final philosophical testament, a book in German called Lebensanschauung, View of Life, it's called in English. He finishes the book in basically just as the war ends and sends the proofs off and then dies, and the book is published in 1918. Here, I'll just make a claim that I can't substantiate, but that book, I think, is really one of the watershed books for the development of existentialist conceptions of the human, and I'll explain what that means. Heidegger reads it, is very impressed. Jaspers, Sartre knew of it because a piece of it had been translated into French. So it's kind of one of those subterranean texts in the history of 20th century philosophy, in a way that Simmel was also sort of forgotten. But there, Simmel has this really interesting argument or idea that in what characterizes the modern world is that he thinks that all worlds historically were predicated on a kind of primal ontological distinction. So the medieval world, the distinction between created being and uncreated being. The Greek world, he thinks, is the distinction between the eternal and the temporal, so the corruptible and uncorruptible. Between reason and volition. And he argues that with late 19th century, as first recognized by Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, what characterizes the modern world is that there's no longer a basic ontological distinction that we use to conceptualize our world. So our world is ontologically homeless. There's no fundamental distinction which structures all other onto categories. So then the question is, there's no possibility for something that is authentic, for something that's absolute, because everything is purely relative. Nonetheless, we have to exist, and he thinks that human beings are looking for authenticity in some form. So he develops a kind of, the only thing that human life, or facticity as he calls it, is thrown upon is itself. And then the way in which the self in the modern world, in a world in which there's no longer any kind of anger, or Lukács would call it, is the condition of what Lukács called transcendental homelessness, Obdachlosigkeit. There's no sheltering sky for us. So there's just existence, our existence with no essence, is what he argues. That in a sense, the way in which we in a sense, try to establish something like authenticity is through the ability to take on responsibility, not only for the choices that we make in life, but for the choice of being the kind of person who makes those choices. So he has this sort of long kind of argument against Kant and others that it's not that there's a categorical imperative because that's tied to reason, it's about life. And when I make a choice for anything, I simply don't make a choice for that thing. I'm also implicitly making a choice to be the kind of person who would be the person, or who is the person who chooses that thing. And so then the question of authenticity is not a question of freedom, it's a question of responsibility vis-a-vis decisions for which there is no other principle than owning up to who I am to become. And it's in that context that he makes this really interesting argument that the scope of when I think about responsibility for myself is not just the scope of all the things I have decided for, or that I'm about to decide for, but it also has to include all the things that I didn't decide for. So he has this argument that the horizon of possibility of a human life includes not only the choices that I made, but also the choices that I didn't make. Because in a sense, when I choose to be a professor and not to be, a soccer player for Paris Saint-Germain, I've also chosen not to be that. Now, of course, that could be affected by contingencies that obviously I'm not as brilliant as Mbappe. So I simply want to say that this already is this very, Sartrean idea that we are who we are as a function of owning up to these choices that include who we are not. And that these choices are always contingent and not completely in our control, like not being a soccer player. I want to suggest, without fleshing out this idea, so I just want to suggest that this idea in Simmel's late thinking, which I think resonates with a lot of Heideggerian authenticity, though it's not being towards death in the same way. But I want to suggest that the kernel of this idea can be found in 1900 with the argument about economic choice. That when I choose for the Porsche and not my kids, this is not the exact same idea that he has in 1918, but it's already that idea that, in a sense, I'm choosing for many selves of who I am. And Simmel has this wonderful aphorism, I'll end with this, that my life includes not only the possibilities that I've become, but also the impossibilities that I didn't become. So my life includes the ghosts or the graves of the selves I am not. And I'd like to suggest that if this is one of the key ideas that he develops in what I'll call his existential conception of life in 1918, that the inspiration for that, or the catalyst for this, is his conception of money. And that's what I mean by money as the medium of self-fashioning. because all of our choices that we make involve money in some form. Being a professor, going to the university, buying these clothes, etc. So that's the sense in which there's a kind of material, monetary basis for an existential conception of the self, which I think Simmel doesn't say this consciously in 1918, but I would call this the monetary unconscious of existentialism that you see in Simmel. And with that, I will thank you for your attention. Yeah, Mike.
As I was listening to your account of the ins and outs of the view, and what stuck out to me is two distinct roles for money in the picture. I mean, there's many roles for money, obviously, but two of them stuck out to me, and one of them actually seems more fundamental to his. It seems the most fundamental to his picture, and that's the role of money in acceleration and circulation, because there's. So I was thinking about money as an accelerant versus money, let's say, as a fetish, right? And he has these arguments that are like Marx that suggest that the money form of exchange sort of hides the true relationality of value, right? But I don't even think that that's necessary. I mean, we couldn't understand, even if there was no fetish that was cloaking those relations, we still couldn't understand them, because as soon as you understand them, they change. I mean, there's no those underlying value relations themselves are just constantly churning in modernity, right? And the reason, part of the story about how they churn so quickly is precisely that money is a sort of medium of acceleration, right? And then, like, you know, once all those relations are constantly shifting under our feet, then we lose our ability to understand ourselves as individual planning agents extended through time. I mean, a lot of other stuff in the view kind of seems to me to fall out of that one piece. And I wondered if you thought, maybe that's not right, and those functions are more connected than I'm making them out to be. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
So I think you're absolutely right, and that's actually a nice precise way of distinguishing. Well, let's say, I mean, there's many functions. Simmel thinks there's many functions for money in the modern world, and I think that's a really nice way that it functions as an accelerator, as a medium of acceleration for the transformation of values, and fashion is for him, would be an example of that. And here, just to add to what you said, not just as an accelerator of the transformation of values, so it gives an account for why values are constantly changing, and constantly changing in a relationship to each other. So it's not just that the value changes, like it goes from value X to value Y, but the positionality of a value to all other values, because he does have this holistic idea that the value of anything is a function of its relation to all other values, and that's constantly always changing. That would be happening anyway, but then in a purely monetary economy, because of our social transactions with things, that accelerates it. Now, so on the one hand, that's the sense in which it's a force of destabilization and fragmentation. But I mean, that's what makes Simmel kind of a slippery or interesting character, depending on how. But Simmel is ambivalent, because on the other hand, Simmel thinks that monetary relations, which on the one hand accelerate this acceleration, and here one of the ambiguities Simon touched on it is sometimes in Simmel it's unclear whether he thinks that this is whether this money as acceleration is a symptom of modernity or the actual catalyst. And that really is something that's quite unstable and difficult to work out. So putting that to the side. So is money symptomatic of this, or is it the real catalyst of it? I mean, that's the question that's difficult to resolve. But however you resolve that, Simmel also thinks that that's distinct from the self-obfuscation, the veiling, if you wish. I mean, I would use almost this Lukashian idea, it's the naturalization of commodities. That's what money economy allows us. So that's also a kind of alienation. That's different than fragmentation. They go hand in hand. But then on the other hand, he also thinks, as I mentioned a moment ago, that all of this is also a kind of fundamental structure of trust. That, in a sense, monetary relations in a modern society is one of the linchpin institutions of trust. And he does think that money is an institution of trust at the end of the day. So that's why you can see he wants to say he has it both ways, or he's capturing something accurate about the phenomenon of money, that it's doing all of these things. And that's another way to say that it's empty, but it can't be captured through contradiction. And that's also why I would say it's not Hegelian. There's no sublation to a higher unity. That might be a different way to think of concrete unity, right? So that's why money is able to allow things to occur that seem to be contradictory without it being a contradiction, without therefore needing for it to be at least conceptually resolved on a higher plane. And that's what he thinks is why then money most clearly is the epitome of modern society. We live in fundamental contradictions without the ability to resolve them. But nonetheless, that society doesn't collapse. And that's why he's not a Marxist, right? He doesn't think that ultimately there is some ultimate contradiction that's going to undo modernity. Now, he still thinks it's about alienation, et cetera, but he doesn't have this idea that somehow modernity is going to implode. No, we're just going to produce more fashion and we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. And who knows what's going to happen? I mean, for Simmel, all bets are off on that. So I don't know if that, but that, I think the way to think about, acceleration, you're absolutely right, the accelerator function, but also stabilizing function, he thinks it's doing as well. Okay, 5 minutes.
Does Simmel have anything like a good faith, bad faith distinction? Are there, in this identity construction that one engages in, are there more or less authentic ways to do it? And if so, what's the criterion that decides one way or the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's complicated. So that's complicated because, he does have this sense that, well, first of all, we'd have to be clear about what we mean by authenticity. Mm-hmm. Authenticity for him, among other things, is about taking on a responsibility for oneself in terms of, in a sense, owning up, and I'll use the language, owning up to becoming the kind of person I've chosen to become. So another way to think about it is, if I've made a choice to be a professor, then that entails all sorts of norms and consequences. And in a sense, what it means to be authentic is that the value of that choice is borne out by how much I actually am consistent with myself as being the kind of person I'm supposed to be. That's partly regulated by social norms, but also partly regulated by what I want to be. So that's a sense, that's one aspect of how he understands authenticity. And there, what's going to be important is that then that means that I can also betray myself. Mm-hmm. I can betray myself because he has this idea, and there's a lot of details that, for example, I'll use a very, when I choose to be a professor, I inscribe myself in a system of oughts, a system of norms. Mm-hmm. Don't plagiarize, blah, blah, blah. And so let's imagine, all of what I've just said is plagiarized. I plagiarized it from Simmel or something. Right? So now I've betrayed myself, right? Now I can do special pleading, or I can rationalize it, because Simmel thinks that there's multiple selves in myself. He doesn't think there's one self. So I can be a kind of self that tries to live with that bad faith, or I can say, I'm an anarchist and no one owns ideas or whatever. Mm-hmm. So he has a kind of complicated account to explain how it is that we can live in bad faith with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, we're constantly trying to arrive at good faith with ourselves, because he also thinks we're always trying to make compromises, because, my duties and obligations as a professor are going to come into conflict with my duties and obligations as a father. You know, I should watch Disney movie with my kids rather than read Simmel or something like that. And you know, it's not a zero-sum game. I'm going to regret the fact, or I'm going to lose out. So that's part of the problem of a modern individual, is that they're constantly trying to struggle these multiple selves, both with social demands, but also with demands of my own satisfaction. Do I want to be more the professor or the father? And there is no teleology, because he doesn't think there's any teleological structure to human striving. Because also there's no completion to my life. So then the question is, how am I, almost in Hegel, how am I with myself? How can I live with myself without any teleology, overarching teleology, and not simply succumbing to social norms? Because he also thinks that social norms can also be experienced as objectifications that are alienating, right? The dean tells me do this, or, you know, I don't know, you know, all these norms that so that's a good example of how as academics, we need to realize ourselves through objectifications of the norms, but we experience these as other, publish or perish and things like that. And the only way we have a good conscience for Simmel is through this ultimate responsibility we take for ourselves.
Got it. Thank you.
If that's helpful. Yeah. I mean, there's more to say, but that's starting to answer that question, which he deals with in the last chapter of the life view of life. It's called in English.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, Simon.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. I just have a question on the Goethe point that you were making, because I'm probably guilty of sort of the forgetfulness about Goethe, and probably very guilty because I had to read Goethe in school, so I should sort of know about this, but I don't. And so the last point that you made on sort of the sort of push towards existentialism, that, you know, that first sounded very Hegelian to me, because it seemed to be all Allgemeines, Besonderes, Einzelnes all over. You know, it's like in the beginning of the philosophy of right, where the will chooses something, it chooses among a variety of things, it chooses that one thing and knows that it doesn't choose the others. And so the way I grasp it, and I just want to sort of, you to confirm this or elaborate on this, that so the Goethean idea is different because sort of Hegel provides us with a rational criterion of what to choose. You know, there's, you know, one right objective object notion, and that's, you know, the spirit self-development. Whereas in Goethe, do I understand it right that sort of the point is sort of the individuality, the self-development, so that it's more Humboldt than Hegel in a sense. So am I in the right direction there?
Yeah. So I mean, here, one, I'll give a cultural context and then more philosophical. So, and this is just a broader point, but so Simmel belongs to a very particular class of German thinkers, who are German Jewish thinkers, like Cassirer, and they come out of the Bildungsbürgertum, and for them it's Goethe. So Goethe is the key reference point, both culturally and philosophically, as against Hegel, because Hegel represents German, Prussian, etc. So there's just a kind of straightforward cultural answer to why Goethe, because that's the philosopher of the German Jewish Bildungsbürgertum, and that's why you see that whole generation of German Jewish thinkers. It's all Goethe. I mean, Cassirer, for example. So that's a kind of cultural thing, and that's how it was played out. I mean, Löwitz sees this very clearly. If you know Löwitz's book. Yeah, so Löwitz has a book about 19th century German philosophy, and he says the fundamental opposition is Hegel-Goethe. That's the fundamental opposition for German thinkers. It's not Kant-Hegel, it is German-Goethe. And then, of course, it's the 1930s that destroys that, because the 1930s destroys German Jewish Bildungskultur, right? It's exterminated, and then it's Hegel, Kant, and so there's a forgetting of Goethe that occurs in the 20s and 30s, and the parting of ways in Davos is exactly that. It's Heidegger and Hölderlin against Goethe. Destruction of Goethe. Hölderlin is the poet of Germany, not Goethe. Cassirer is Goethe. So that's the cultural dynamics background of Goethe. But then in the vocabulary and the thinking, now textual, as he's writing this Lebensanschauung book where he's proposing what I'm calling this existential thing, he writes these sort of exploratory essays for his ideas, which are readings of Goethe. So they're like drafts of it. But then the term that he uses for the subject, it's not spirit, it's not self-positing, it's Goethe's term of Urphänomen. Life is an Urphänomen. And it's an Urphänomen that then sort of manifests or expresses itself in various, through its Werk, its Wirkungen, it's what it does, what it creates, et cetera, et cetera. And an Urphänomen is irreducible. It's a kind of absolute that's irreducible. And it's not rational, but it's not irrational. It's a kind of facticity of life, if you wish. So, and then the term he uses is Wechselwirkung, which again is a Goethean term from Goethe's morphology of plants and things like that. So this kind of environmental idea that life isn't anything outside of its morphology of forms that it takes, and it is both more than those forms and less than those forms, right? And then what you need is a critique of an analysis of culture as a morphology of all the forms of life that is constantly shaping and reshaping itself. So that's a sense in which it's not a Hegelian conception. And that's also why it goes to authenticity, because it's also modeled on the relationship of an artist to a work of art. I create something autonomous. I don't grasp its meaning. It's more than my intention, and it's not like this kind of object. But then an artist has a sense of whether they are true to their artwork or not. And if they're true to their artwork, then they are true to themselves. So there is a kind of an aesthetic paradigm that Simmel uses for his philosophy of life, almost like a lot of existentialists. It's almost modeled on the artist, right? So that's the longer answer, or the shorter answer to what would have to be a longer discussion about Goethe, specifically for Simmel.
So and that's a kind of a sort of a soothing answer, because it would allow someone to feel at home in this kind of world without sort of absolute values or a foundation, so that's where I get why sort of you don't have that very negative reading of it, because that sort of completes the picture of a possibility of making something.
Exactly. And so there I would say, just going back to this conversation we're having, there's a kind of trajectory. I mean, you're absolutely right that tossing money or in the essays, it seems much more pessimistic. I think Simmel then realizes I have to give an answer.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's ambivalent and not pessimistic, it doesn't matter. But he realizes I have to give an answer. And the Lebensanschauung book, he calls it his final philosophical testament, is the answer to the problem of modernity. Namely, how can I be authentic in a world in which there is no gods, in a world ruled by money?
Did you read Nietzsche?
Yes. So what's interesting about Simmel is the first academic philosopher to lecture on Nietzsche, 1900. So the year just before Nietzsche died, because no one thought Nietzsche was a serious philosopher, right? Till Jaspers and Heidegger, things like that. So he gives a lecture course, which then he publishes as a book on Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, because he sees Schopenhauer and Nietzsche as the first philosophers of life. And there is a lot of Nietzschean self-creation, authenticity.
Hearing that in your characterization of the artist as potentially the figure that could be authentic, that was bringing some bells.
So that's exactly, and he was perceived as a kind of avant-garde Nietzschean sociologist. That's why a lot of artists like Rilke and they were very attracted to Simmel because he was the first person taking Nietzsche seriously. Artists were obviously Haussmann, etc. But yeah, in that sense, there's this very strong Nietzschean element in his thinking, absolutely.
So when these people are looking at Goethe, you mentioned the morphology of plants, but then are they thinking of particular works of his, or just his career as a whole, like the Nietzsche, Goethe's Übermensch thing?
Yeah, what's interesting, I don't want to make too much of a tangent, but what's interesting about is that Goethe never wrote philosophy. So that's part of the reason why, and I'll just say it very brutally, no one in philosophy knows Goethe because he didn't write a philosophy book, right? He didn't write a philosophical treatise. Though again, this whole generation, you go to gymnasium and you're reading Goethe. So here, in terms of the text, it's the morphology of 1821, 1822 is absolutely central. The theory of light, the Farbenlehre, and then the conversations with Eckermann, because it's in these conversations with Eckermann that all of the philosophical ideas that Goethe is, sort of bubbling from his head are recorded. So that part of the difficulty for, let's call it, intellectual historians is how do you reconstruct and understand the tremendous importance of a philosopher, or how do you understand the philosophical importance of someone who wasn't strictly speaking a philosopher and did write a philosophical text, but nonetheless was clearly very influential. And then, of course, the other one is Faust. I mean, Faust is absolutely central. We didn't get a chance to talk about it, but money is this fundamental problem in Faust. And then Willem Meister's Lehrjahre is all about this, how can the individual become whole and strive to discover themselves in the changing structure of a modern society.
So it's like a proto-existentialist.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's how Simmel is going to read it. But in terms of text, these are the little fragments here and there. And the other thing is that when you read like Simmel's essays on Goethe or Cassirer, they also belong to a kind of intellectual tradition where they're not quoting anything, because it's all oral memory. So they're just saying Goethe says this.
Right.
And then you're like, where does he say that? Well, you have to go to some Goethe expert who can tell you, oh, it's in this and this, because they're, in a sense, they're seamlessly almost ventriloquizing Goethe all the time. And that's because they belong to a very different culture where Goethe is not a text of the past. Goethe is a real culture that they're part of. And so that's why then their use of it is not marked in a way that you would quote Hegel.
Yeah, it's like Plato quotes like Lost Plays of Aeschylus, just randomly.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Or Nietzsche does the same thing. Nietzsche is constantly quoting without telling you he's quoting. So that's part of also the difficulty of discerning the Goethe. If we don't belong to that culture, we don't see it. Right? And that's why I said it's a real loss philosophically. You just don't see it. But yeah, those are the texts. I mean,
yeah,
where to start to sort of piece together. But again, Goethe never had a philosophy as such.
yeah.
More of a couple of remarks and a question. First of all, I teach a course on what is money, freshman seminar. I opened the course by playing Wu-Tang's Cream.
Okay.
I would actually be really interested in knowing more about your reading of it.
Okay.
Second, thank you. I now know who to blame for PSG's constant failures in the Champions League.
Okay.
I'm sure you're taking responsibility for that.
I was with that team in Europe, and even France could make it out of the UEFA Nations. But anyway, that's not a conversation.
There's been something that's come up a couple of times, at least for me, over this, is just that I sort of, there seems to be a kind of almost an absent Heideggerian philosophy of money. It seems like money as a question of technology, money as sort of a foundation of existential being. And I don't know what to do with it. And one thing that occurs to me is that I feel like maybe to some extent some of that is what's happening or what's trying to happen in the parts of Derrida's Donner le Temps that I keep bouncing off of every time I look at it. But I don't know if you have any idea of what a Heideggerian philosophy of money might be, if it would be desirable.
Can I give you a snide answer?
Of course.
As you know, the infamous Schwarze Hefte, money is associated uniquely with the Jews.
Uh-huh.
So I'm not saying this is a Heideggerian philosophy of money, but that might be
why there isn't a Heideggerian philosophy of money.
In the sense that, Heidegger internalizes and then radicalizes within his own framework the stock anti-Semitic prejudice. Jews are calculated rationality, quantification, money, basically. And so that could be, again, it's a snide answer, but it could also be one of the reasons why in the Heideggerian unconscious, there's no philosophy of money. Let me just say two more things, because it's a really fascinating question. In Simmel, I would say it's pretty clear in the sense that the philosophy of money, among other things, is a very indirect way to disabuse the anti-Semitic prejudice that Jews are about money. because it's trying to say, look, all of modernity is about money, right? So it's important that, this is also a book that's written in the aftermath of what was called the Berliner Antisemitismusstreit, this very violent cultural debate about Jews and anti-Semitism in the 1880s, 1890s. So after the unification of Germany, with major figures that were involved, Hermann Cohen, theologians, Treitschke, things like that. So the philosophy of money, though Simmel had a very secular relationship to his Jewish identity, but in one sense, you can read this book as tacitly destroying the anti-Semitic prejudice of Jews and money, because Jews are the cipher of modernity and all of the ailments of modernity. That's how Heidegger mobilizes that. And here you have money as the real cipher of modernity. It has nothing to do with tradition. So, but also I think in Heidegger, you mentioned Derrida. I think part of it in Heidegger, this is also something interesting that hasn't come up yet in our discussions, that this very sharp opposition between a gift that is not instrumentalized, cannot be inscribed in economy, something that becomes, as an obsessive theme in French philosophy. Marion, Derrida, the gift that is not a gift, that can't be inscribed in measure. It's not falls within instructions of rationality, doesn't enter into the economy of circulation, Georges Bataille, etc. Heidegger also has this very strict distinction between, the immanence of being in its forgettingness of its relationship to being, which is all about, economic and technological transactions, etc., and then something else that can't be inscribed in that. So it could also be that, like Derrida thinks there's this underlying structure between the economic, or Levinas, the economic system of exchange and equivalencies, rationality in that sense, and then this interruption of that, whether it's alterity or whatever. Heidegger clearly has this almost very Gnostic opposition, especially in the 30s. It's almost a kind of Marcionism that he has, there's a kind of corruption and fallenness, and we are waiting for the God that will destroy and release us from that. And that can't be inscribed into any kind of economic rationality for him. That's why that sacrifice in Heidegger is so important, right? His lectures of Hölderlin, etc. The sacrifice that is for nothing, that ruptures our attachment to the wasteland and opens the new secret Germany, whatever, das Vaterland. So that could be the way in which sacrifice as opposed to economy, sacrifice as opposed to money, structures Heidegger's thinking. And as you know, in French thinking, that's a perennial kind of problem in Bataille, etc.
But there are left Heidegger, so there are from Derrida himself 3 or 4 books or texts on money, which we could call left Heidegger.
Exactly,
so
yeah.
False Geld, Marx Ghost, the prices rise.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I was saying Heidegger specifically, but you're absolutely right.
Of course, it's not directly Heidegger and money, but so I would say in a way it's a left Heideggerian attempt to use and say the temporality of money and the particularity that Heidegger was struggling that something is always present only in its absence, and he just tries. And there's also in Germany, there's 2 or 3 books to try the same. So I think it's not translated, but Länger, Marx zufolge is also attempt to mix together Heidegger and money and value. Also, my book was rejected because of left Heideggerianism from the publishing houses. So I also tried this to do.
Yeah, no, I really, you're absolutely right in there. But Eric Aliès, Eric Aliès's book on temps.
There's also a woman who wrote something, I think maybe she's even French, but there's a German version, I read it in the German. It was also about credit and subjectivity and money in Derrida, which is also then, again, a left Heideggerian attempt.
So Eric Aliès is a student of Derrida who has time and money, goes back to Aristotle, and also, so yeah, you're actually right, there's that comes out of Heidegger. But yeah,
I just wonder, this raises a broader question about the project, right? Not your project, the Philosophy of Money handbook. Is it possible for us to talk about philosophy and money without talking about money and anti-Semitism, right? I mean, there are a number of contributions in the handbook that relate to medieval Jewish thought, like Daniel's presentation. There are certainly Jewish philosophers that appear, but I wonder, just given the role that the connection between anti-Semitism and money has played historically, I think going back forever, whether there isn't some, I mean, I raised this because I won't be able to attend all of the toolbox dialogue tomorrow, but it seems to me that this is something that should maybe be on the radar.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in the paper I'm going to write, I was going to have one brief little comment.
I'm sure it'll be discussed,
what we
right?
talked about, but you're absolutely right, yeah.
The issue is whether this is something to be addressed maybe in the introduction, right? That kind of ties together these themes that are going to be addressed in the different essays.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And then it is teaching this course. One of the things that I realized, right, like 2-3 weeks into teaching this course on the theories of money is I had to do an entire class on anti-Semitism. Because you just couldn't understand the discourse without understanding it through the history of anti-Semitism.
Well, I think it's so hard. I mean, when you deal with younger students, right, and you talk about 20th century history, or I mean, even 19th century history, anti-Semitism seems like this thing that almost pops out of nowhere, right? And it has these historical linkages with the role that the Jews played in lending and things like that, and it was just
that's a
something for the
fantastic
group
point.
to
I
think
think
about.
tomorrow, that's a great suggestion. Well, thank you very much. Also, I think.
Thank you.